So let's have a look at this one I wrote a few weeks ago. So here's this classic quote. "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he doesn't exist." And this is attributed to Charles Baudelaire, French poet. I'd just like to point out that a lot of the time in the modern West, this sort of religious language, it often just gets automatically dismissed. This is another mental program that a lot of us are brought up with, where we just kind of hear anything that's biblical and we just lump it into the category of nonsense. But I think that what gets missed in a lot of the dismissal of religious ideas is that any sort of ancient narrative like that, where they're valuable, is that they have taken certain things about reality and distilled them into a narrative structure and certain characters, and they're representing certain things about reality. And so I think that you can safely say that the concept of the devil would be a good representation of all the things in human nature that are more on the dark side. So all the evil and the greed and the deception, the devil is a good representation of this. And so in relation to this particular quote, I'm going to invoke the concept of the devil to represent the idea of corruption. You can see here that I've tagged his quote, put it into context here. "A society that has been trained to dismiss the notion of conspiracy is a society ripe for harvest." The idea of corruption and the idea of conspiracy are very tightly linked. So in relation to this quote, I'm somewhat tying them together, but I'm going to focus it in on the idea of corruption, but with the acknowledgement that corruption then breeds into conspiracy as it spreads. So when you think about the goals of corruption, the primary goal is whatever self-interested thing that corruption is attempting to achieve. But there's also always going to be a secondary goal, which is to hide the processes of the corruption. So it's attempting to gain something, but it's also attempting to hide it. And so I think that when you look at this quote, "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he doesn't exist," I think that this is a good representation of the aim of corruption to hide itself. And I think that this is a very interesting idea in our modern social context, where we see so much of this automated programming in just dismissing the idea of conspiracy and essentially dismissing the idea of corruption, and therefore dismissing the idea of evil and self-interest and greed. And it's like, if these programs are so heavily interwoven into our collective psyche, is this evidence of there being widespread corruption and conspiracy? Because is this an example of the devil, in this case meaning corruption, having done so much work to hide itself that it's managed to get into our very minds, to propagate so much of this idea that conspiracy and corruption is laughable and not even worth thinking about, that's where it's doing a lot of its work. It's getting into our very fucking psyches and removing the idea there. Now, I'm not saying that this is obviously what's happening, but I think it's an incredibly interesting way to think about the current situation. And so this idea of dismissing conspiracy and corruption, I think it shows a real disconnect with reality, because we know that corruption is a common occurrence. We see it in politicians, we see it in CEOs, yet we seem to have this totally bizarre, irrational belief that it's not something worth thinking about at any sort of large scale. And yet it happens, and we know it happens. And even when we see it happen and when we see it openly admitted, then we still carry on as though it doesn't. And so when you think about any sort of corruption or conspiratorial behavior, there's only so much you can do to hide it, especially if it's widespread and spreading across many different systems. And especially in a modern age where we are so highly connected and we just can communicate so quickly. And so you would obviously do whatever you can to keep it in the shadows, but then you're not going to be able to keep it all hidden. So it's going to spill out in certain places. And so this is why I think that it would be incredibly valuable to propagate cultural programs that are intended to cause people to believe that it's a good idea and that you're the smart one for dismissing anybody who dares say that there's any sort of conspiratorial behavior going on, because this acts as a mop for the overspill. It means that it can spill out there and you don't have to be completely worried about it, because you've programmed the culture so much that it doesn't actually get into that many places. It remains in a minority, and that minority can just be disparaged and dismissed. Furthermore, even more so than that, even more than hiding it, even more than fostering cultural programs to dismiss it, the most powerful thing that you could do if you wanted to enact some very complex conspiratorial behavior is that ideally you would wrap that aim into some other narrative that is at face value incredibly virtuous and good and necessary. So if you can get everybody to buy into a certain narrative that you can then hide your real intentions behind, and not only buy into and accept, but also to viciously attack anybody who dares question that narrative, then this would be a really powerful way of achieving your goals. And whether or not this is actually occurring, I can't say for sure. But what I can say for sure is that the devil is out there. There is evil and greed and self-interest out in the world, looking for opportunities to manifest and do whatever it can for its own gains, and to hide the fact that it's doing that. So the devil is out there. And so perhaps we should actually be looking out for it instead of just dismissing the very notion that it exists.